This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WFD, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. I wanted to deal with fire today. The Australians and other people around the world are having problems with fire, and it's often affected by the climate warming and other landscape situations. I grew up with fires that were mostly naturally generated. 2,000-foot mountain nearby that would catch on fire and burn for weeks. Very spectacular. We could see the trees would fall like sparklers. And sometimes that fire would come into the areas where we lived, and we had to deal with it. But mostly those were natural fires, and that continued. Sometimes there is human intervention which affects things, but the terrain is important. I think I should give you a little review of the geology so that you know what's going on. There's a huge continental plate called Gondwana land. It's an Aboriginal name, but it applies to the whole continent and how it moves. It's roughly the same area as continental United States. The winds tend to blow from west to east, and they're influenced by geology. The geology is such that these large plate, or the large plate, is lifting up over another landmass. So the basic landmass that is Gondwana land is a sedimentary soils that have lifted up out of the ocean floor. They're sandstones, shales, and limestones in horizontal manner, and they're well leached, so they're not very fertile. As they get to the east and the land mass rides up over another continental plate, then there are mountains, and all along the east coast of Australia there's this mountain range. It's basically follows the coast, and its uplift. The highest mountain is about 7,000 feet, but mostly about 2,000 or 3,000 feet. So it's not a very high range, but it's enough for wind-blown rains from the Indian Ocean to go right across Australia, across its deserts, and then as it hits the mountains, the clouds rise up and then precipitate on those mountains. The water to the east, adjacent to the Pacific, runs on short rivers to the coast. The inland rivers take some of that rainfall west, and it eventually ends up in the Australian Bight. And it runs through areas that are slopes. So that continental plate that's being lifted up is dropping slowly to the west, and some of that rainfall runs down there. Still fairly dry. Near to the mountains, it's good for agriculture, but as you get further west, you get to have low rainfall and desert situations. The native vegetation adapts to this, adapts to the soils. Some of the soils are influenced by the winds that bring salt from the Indian Ocean right across to the east of Australia. That has an influence on the soil and on the plants that are derived from those soils. That mountain range is disturbed by tectonic movements and faults and cracks, and are established which reach down into the magma of the earth, and so you have little volcanic areas that poke through the sedimentary rocks. They're very noticeable. They're intermittent. They're not extensive, but they create and what is called an edaphic soil. So the soil is very noticeably different where you have volcanic soils, volcanic geology that brings up rich material that's not leached like the surrounding sedimentaries. The areas receive rainfall from the Indian Ocean, but they also receive tropical rain from monsoons coming south in the summertime. The same vegetation on the sedimentary and on the igneous areas, it's the same. The rain that falls on the shales and sandstones and limestones often percolates easily and runs through the rock patterns, or it runs off. So those areas have a drought way of surviving. That means that those plants there are characterized by eucalypts that are kind of wizen and not awfully healthy. Well, they're very healthy because they're adapted to their terrain, but they are nothing like a tall eucalyptus tree growing on the banks of a river. The understory herbs and the creatures associated have adapted well to drought situations, and they're very unique. I'm just yesterday talking to John Taft, and Mary Kay Selecki, who had just been to Australia to look at the rather wonderful native vegetation, especially on the west coast of Australia. It's amazing. I miss it a lot. The igneous areas that receive the same rainfall are likely to absorb it and make use of that same rainfall, and the result is tropical rainforests or subtropical rainforests, depending on whether you're north or south in Australia. This sort of pattern has a lot to do with fire. The mountain range can run right down to the Pacific Ocean in some places. In other places there's 60 or even more miles of coastal subplain. The fires that you're dealing with at the present time are in the Sydney area, and that has a plain that's probably about 60 miles wide, and we'll get back to that later. I grew up at the foot of the escarpment. It was probably 40 or 50 miles from the coast, but there was one range that went right to the coast. For those that might be interested, this is in the Bellingen or Coffs Harbour area. The range runs down to the coast at Coffs Harbour. Early settlement was by rivers. Those fairly fast-flowing coastal rivers would take coastal steamers. Later, the railroads came, and when you had a mountain that ran down to the ocean, that mountain could be used to make a gentle railroad line up to the peak. The peak was a plateau. It was very hard to get over that plateau, but eventually they did get trains up to and on top of the plateau, and then you could still bring commodities to the train. Eventually the train got down onto the slopes and to the hinterlands. Thora was a little town nestled in the front edge of the plate tectonics escarpment. River ran along the front of the escarpment, draining the areas above, which were largely volcanic. The drain off that volcanic area created alluvial floodplains that were reasonably fertile. So mixed agriculture could be corn and beans and mixed crops and pasture on the floodplain on either side of the river. Mostly on the east side of the river, because the river was very close to the 2,000-foot range. When it came to one of those parts of the escarpment that moved out into the ocean, then the river turned at a right angle and exited to the Pacific. Above us, there was a 2,000-foot mountain, and a road that for 7 miles was curves and very interesting but difficult road to negotiate. The farmers in our area on the coastal plain were well aware that the volcanic soils to the above us were rich, and so sometimes they would buy land on the plateau and do dairying and mixed agriculture. Some of the techniques used to develop were involving fire. This is rather cruel, but it happened in other countries too. You would notch about 30 trees on the west side of a plot of volcanic vegetation, tropical rainforest, and then you'd wait for a storm to occur, and by domino effect, the notched trees would fall over, and then you could fall perhaps a mile square of tropical rainforest. The roots were not that deep, and the trees were felled. Were then salvaged for the lumber that was needed for shipbuilding, railroad car building, and so those elements were sought and taken out. I can remember them coming down the 7-mile face of the escarpment and going to Bellingen, which was about 10 miles on the coastal plain, and they would be going to the Dopal shipbuilding yards on the river, the coastal river. There weren't very good coastal harbors, so if you were going to come to our area by coastal ship, you often had to get into a basket and be lifted out of the ship by a crane that would land you on a jetty that would project out into the ocean, sometimes protected by walls of stone, but it wasn't easy to negotiate the coast. So trains eventually came in, and they could manage the escarpment sometimes with zigzag-type railroads that allowed you to get speed up to get up the next little piece, and then so on to the top. So part of the area that is burning at the moment is in the Coffs Harbour area, Nana Glen, and that is where there was a railroad that went up to the plateau in a place called Dorrigo, just 7 miles above where I grew up. And eventually that railroad has become a historic museum, and a lot of the retired steam engines that ran Australian railroads are preserved at that location. The fires often produced by lightning, sometimes by Aboriginal activities, sometimes by early settlers, would be spectacular, and you couldn't do anything about them because you didn't have roads in there, and it was part of nature, and we anticipated it intermittently. as settlers came in and settled, that was a problem. But sometimes that sort of firing was a result of settlement on the plateau above. And so when the trees were taken out for wood, for shipbuilding, then what was left over was burned and gradually converted to pasture. And that had a lot to do with the character of the plateau and plateau farming. The land had been stripped of its trees, but result was good pasture for cattle and good agriculture for crops. But it left the terrain very vulnerable to wind. There was a total loss of all the wildlife and birds that went with the rainforest. And as a result, a grub moved in, and the grub moved in to such an extent that it destroyed many of the pastures. So the next level of this fired paradigm was to bring in conifers that grew fast but were not related to the tropical rainforest that had been removed. And that broke down the wind a little and allowed wildlife to come back in and control in a reasonably natural way the excess of grubs that had got into the pastures. It was a very windy place. I can remember our blacksmith from down the road commenting that if you went to the toilet and it was out in the wind, you had to be quick because you didn't know whether the wind would take your toilet away. And so that's how we grew up. We were down low, and the wind was less, and the rivers ran past, and we were still in a drier territory. And you have to imagine that the farming on the coastal plain was mainly on the riverbanks that had received a little bit of the nutriment of the volcanic outliers above. So there was agriculture, two types of agriculture. There was the dairying and the hogs and the what we call copying agriculture. That means you are working the soil for crops like potatoes and peas and that you could sell. We were 300 miles from Sydney, so you couldn't sell milk, for instance. Milk had to be separated into cream, and a cream cart would take the cream to a butter factory. That butter factory would produce butter and send it to England, firstly in windjammers and then in early steamers. It might take you 6 weeks to get to England, so the butter had to be fairly well salted. And the fruit and vegetables often were subject to sugars. Sugars and salt create an exosmosis, which means that the water is taken out of bacteria and fungi that might destroy the value of the butterfat going to England or the continent. So Australians, not unlike Americans, have a heavy salt association. They've gotten used to it. And if you are dealing with apricots that are dried and dried with sugar content, that is often bred into the plant in the first place, they could be transported. The leftover milk went to hogs, and we would have a trough made out of a hollowed out tree, and we would feed the hogs on milk. And there was also crops like corn that could supplement it. But we would let the milk sour, so it was like junket, and that was much more effective for the hogs. Their fresh milk gave them diarrhea, so people learned how to deal with the milk and not give it quickly. There were orchards, there were oranges and peaches and pears and apples. So you've got an idea of what the coastal plain was like where I grew up. It was between Sydney and Brisbane and nestled underneath that escarpment. Going back to Sydney and going back to the history, in the late 1700s, convicts could no longer be sent to the US, so Australia was a recipient of convicts, and they arrived after Captain Cook had surveyed the area and suggested that harbours near to Sydney would be appropriate. They settled on this coastal plain, which was largely Waianamarra shales and Hawkesbury limestones. That was very poor soil. The Aboriginals that knew how to handle this territory and knew how to hunt it and how to survive in it were very generous and taught the arriving convicts and the military staff and taught them how to survive. And it was highly likely that the early settlements would have starved to death if it hadn't been for the generosity of the Aboriginals. Shortly, the Aboriginals began to realize that the settlers were taking over their territory, and in a manner that they weren't used to. They treated the land in a holistic manner, and they found it very hard to have rectilinear plots that were owned by people. The same situation happened here. Early settlers came, and then they would begin to want to own pieces of land, and that was not the typical thing that was tribal sustainability. People may have territories, but they were not going to export or utilize little patches that were owned by various people, from Quakers up to anyone that's settled. So the same thing happened at Sydney, where there was about a 60 mile of coastal plain, and then this escarpment. The escarpment was a barrier for exploration because it had canyons like you have in Colorado, and you could follow the canyon to its early roots, but you couldn't climb up the cliffs above it. If you found your way on the top, it was also a problem because you came to the edge of a plateau, and you didn't know how to get down that edge. So early settlers were confined to the rather poor quality vegetation in the Sydney area. Eventually, Blaxland, Wentworth, and Lawson, 3 explorers, found their way up onto the mountains and over the plateau. And after that, there was a zigzag that allowed the railroad to find its way up the escarpment and onto the plateau. They still didn't get to go down the slopes on the other side. The plateau was probably about 100 miles wide, and then you had to go down. And that, in these days, has been solved by tunnels and zigzags, and so eventually rail got to the hinterlands. But for a long time, people who had sheep and cattle on the slopes had to either transport them or drove them up onto the plateau to market them. There were some of the parts of Australia that are in a different era, and there was accumulation of Carboniferous era plants that created coal. So on that west slopes there was coal. Going back to Sydney, you have to realize that there's not a lot of activity out in the hinterlands, so most of the population in Australia is in 5 major cities, including Sydney as one of them. And gradually those cities have expanded westly, and often the working population is on that rather infertile coastal plain, and the houses are close, and that happens to have an influence on how fire can be controlled. There's not a lot of water available, so water has to be shipped in from dams that corral the water that's in those gullies and gulches and areas that run back into the escarpment. Settlers tended to then gradually occupy the plateau. It's become a tourist place because it has interesting terrain. It's high enough that occasionally you can get snow, but rather a more affluent society. And that has its relationship to fire too, because it's always very attractive to plant your house on a situation can look over the escarpment to Sydney and even see the Sydney Harbour Bridge on a clear day, and develop your house in a situation that becomes rather vulnerable to the terrain that you're attracted to. So my people eventually moved from the coastal plain to the north to Blaxland, which was one of these plateau towns that looked over the coastal plain, and they retained the native vegetation and enjoyed being in a plot that was first developed by convicts as Old Bathurst Road. Bathurst was on the slopes, and there was a convict road that ran up this escarpment. It had lots of hairpin bends and You can imagine bullock teams moving past my people's house. But they were too also near the dry sclerophyll forests, which are these basically eucalypt forests that are on dry terrain. And they're very vulnerable. And there was a little looseness in administering these areas, and people would have their own landfill dumps where they tended to light fires. And those fires sometimes would catch wind, and the fire would extend up the valleys and eventually be endangering the settlers that had settled in the lower Blue Mountains and upper Blue Mountains. The accessibility was very poor because you couldn't have easy access with roads. The railroads did go up and across the plateau, but they weren't servicing the regions to the north and south of the railroad. And towns grew up, and firefighting became an important thing. Most people learned by the seat of their pants to do things that were appropriate. For instance, you never let leaves grow in the gutters of your house. You often didn't have laid-on water, so you had tanks, but you hoped that the tanks would be filled with water from the roofs. And if not, you might actually bring in water, but a house could be saved if you were able to hose it down with water so that the temperature of the materials didn't kind of explode as fires came near. If you were wise, the community would have areas burned so that the litter didn't accumulate. That's part of the nature of the eucalyptus forest, is that the bark and leaves fall and create a litter that has been activated to fire by mostly lightning. So if you let it accumulate, which is a temptation, then you have the potential for fire. So removing the litter is important. And small fire departments would come on board, and you would have some roads bulldozed so that there was accessibility. Many of these places are national parks because it's rather wonderful in the first place, but it's not accessible in the second place. So some of the fires that are raging are where fires coalesce, and they can actually die, but when they first get together to coalesce, you can have some huge conflagrations. The wind is important. The wind can blow your fire afield. There's also, these fires create their own thermals. So you have hot air going up in the sky, and with it can go a piece of bark that is burning, and it can be transported 3 miles and land on a house that is in a safe area, and you'll get to be amazed that this is happening. But it's fairly regular that the thermals can extend way beyond the current fire bank. And some of this sort of thing has been happening in California. So being educated about fire is important. To know your terrain, to perhaps not remove all the tropical rainforest, but leave some. And that takes us back to the Amazon and the removal of forests there, and the human involvement that can happen. There's a temptation to take plants that have adapted to fire and utilize them for agriculture. The native plants may be more nutritious, but we have a thing called blady grass, and it's very coarse, probably coarse because of the constant burning. And our next door neighbor would light a fire in the blady grass, and it would burn the ridge that was near us, and people would have to suddenly come out and preserve the public hall and the school and a few other things. But this was a gentleman who was creating a green pick for his cattle, and when he passed, we didn't have the problem again, but this was where you have human intervention using fire. Sometimes you can backfire. If you see a fire coming towards you, you can burn in advance, so there's no fuel matrix there. So we sympathize with the Australians at the present time. I grew up with having to keep sacks that we could put in water and use to thump out fire. If you didn't have a sack like that, you had branches of broken off a tree so that you would work on the fire. You could either smother the fire by denying it oxygen, or you could whack at it. If you whacked at the fire, there's always a chance that you're going to send pieces of fire around. So the way you worked with the fire depended on people knowing how to deal with it and knowing their terrain, so that they would know where there were natural fire breaks and that the fire could be expected to stop. Interestingly enough, I was at the farmers market yesterday, and we had people who are getting excited about putting prairie in their front yards. And so prairie is also subject to fire, mostly through lightning strikes, sometimes through Indian interested people making a horseshoe of a prairie and then hunting the creatures that came out through the opening. So the native population got to be realizing that a prairie that was not burned gradually became depauperate. But if you burned it, you might burn a few creatures and a snake or two, but in a long run, it would be a healthier prairie. So they got to burn. The settlers that came liked to settle where there was forest, rolling territory that was morainic and not unlike their Irish or European landscape. But they didn't like fires, and that has led to the accumulation of litter, natural litter, which then becomes a hazard. So the fire departments have gotten to be much better at being aware that not only prairies but forests have to be burned from time to time. It's called control burn. It's organized. You do it when you're not going to create a problem. You make sure that the wind is less than 15 miles an hour. You can check that out by licking your index finger and putting it in the air, and you can tell where the wind is coming from. It has to be in a weather pattern where you don't have the wind direction changing all the time. If you're on a roadside, burning a roadside prairie, and you are faced with a change in direction, you should not have a fire in hand that was smoking across the road and cause transportation damages and death. You start with a very small fire, perhaps, and 10 by 10, and you isolate it by raking the matrix, so only the matrix is there, and then that gives you an idea of whether the fire is going to be regular or a little rambunctious. You cut fire breaks so that you burn a piece at a time instead of trying to burn a mile at once, where you don't have any control. You have equipment to wear that is not likely to catch on fire. You wear boots. You make sure your hair doesn't get to be a target for burning. You don't put your cameras close to fire because the Canada balsam that brings parts of the lens together vulnerable to heat. You watch places like booths that are exchange boxes for telephones or electrical towers, which mostly used to be wood, but these days are more likely to be steel. But the wooden ones especially are subject to burning. And you make sure that you don't have people trapped between the piece of prairie that you're burning and the one that's the next section and the next section. So you have to have a leader and perhaps radio contact so that you have safety. But the people who are interested in putting prairies into their front yard don't always realize that burning is a part of the prairie. And you don't necessarily have to burn. We do have specialists who can burn to within 4 inches of a frame house. But most amateurs don't know how to do that. You're trying to create a scudsy fire rather than a bonfire. So you don't line up the vegetation into a big pile. What that will do is sterilize the soil. So a scudsy fire will get the lightweight litter without destroying the roots of the plants and the seeds. So these little things lead to fire departments having fire wagons with a misty spray they can go in with. Little fire trucks that have a amount of water that they can cart, and a hose can actually protect phone booths and electrical settings. And if you do have a fire on a roadside and the wind changes, you put the fire out as fast as you can. You have to make sure that you don't burn in a season where the grass is already green. Because if the grass that is green burns, it creates smoke. So if you have a fire that is on greenish territory, then you're going to have a very smoky fire. A good prairie burn on a dry site can be almost smokeless. You also have to let people know what you're doing so that they understand. Some people have asthma, and they can be affected by fire, so you have to let the local jurisdiction, the city or the village or the township, know what you're doing. The state has gotten active in giving a license to people who have done fire training. And now we do have specialists who have degrees in fire control and fire use. And often those people are also biologists who know what they're working with. So I encourage you to, when you're planting your pollinator plot or the prairie plot in your front yard, to remember that fire is a part of that plot, and it can actually hit you sometimes when you don't expect it. But to be prepared, and if you don't have fire, you can give the prairie a haircut so that you take away some of that accumulated litter. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.